They thought she was just a lonely old lady, quiet, polite, a bit odd. But every Sunday she wrote letters from someone long gone. And in her basement, silence was never empty. Subscribe. The truth isn't shouted, it's whispered. Mrs. Caroline Westbrook lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Eugene, Oregon. She was 62, tutored for many years, and known on her street as Miss K. She wore her silvery hair pulled back in neat low buns, favoured floral blouses and hand-knit shawls, and baked lemon muffins every other Thursday for the church donation table. Her lawn was always trimmed, her hydrangeas meticulously pruned, and the American flag on her porch never hung crooked. To the neighbours she was a gentle oddity, kind, reserved, slightly eccentric in the way ageing women are allowed to be. She never caused trouble, always returned a wave, and spoke softly with a trace of an old East Coast lilt that no one could quite place. Her home smelled like lavender and old wood. She lived alone, though some remembered a brief period, 5 or 6 years ago, when a much younger woman had stayed with her for a while. A foster arrangement, someone said. A girl without family. She didn't stay long. The story had come in pieces, as stories in quiet neighbourhoods tend to do. One neighbour recalled that Miss K had once mentioned volunteering with youth outreach programmes back in her working years. Another had seen the girl, early 20s, thin, with a nervous posture, carrying a suitcase up Miss K's porch steps one late summer afternoon. She stayed for a couple of months. Some thought she was a distant niece. Others assumed she was part of a church effort to help young women transition out of state care. Then one day she was gone. No car came. No goodbyes were heard. Just gone. Miss K never spoke about it, but she didn't deny it either. When asked, she would smile faintly and say something vague, like, "She's off living her life now, I suppose." No one pushed further. The neighbourhood wasn't the kind that trafficked in confrontation. What gave people pause, if anything, was Miss K's habit. On the first Saturday of every month, without fail, she would leave the house at dawn carrying a modest bouquet of white roses wrapped in brown butcher paper. She wore a long grey coat and her sensible walking shoes, and she always returned just before sundown, empty-handed and withdrawn. No one knew where she went. No one asked. Inside her house, the air was still. Nothing ever moved without purpose. Books aligned by size. Curtains always drawn at the same hour. A cabinet in the corner of her bedroom held a stack of cream-coloured envelopes tied with a pale green ribbon. Each one bore the same neat label, "To Caroline from Margaret." The handwriting was crude, shaky, uneven. Not because the writer was uneducated, but because Caroline had written them herself with her non-dominant hand. Every Sunday, after her morning tea, she sat down at the same small desk by the window and wrote a letter. She always chose different pens, but the same voice, a girl's voice. Grateful, warm, distant. She never read the letters more than once. After finishing each one, she sealed it, kissed the corner, and placed it at the bottom of the stack. She would then return to her tea and look out the window as if expecting someone who never came. The neighbours believed she missed the girl, that perhaps she had become a surrogate mother, that she had loved and lost. They weren't entirely wrong, but Caroline's grief wasn't simple. It wasn't clean, it was ritual, it was maintenance, it was part of the order of her life, as tightly folded and carefully concealed as the letters in her drawer. Before Margaret, Caroline's life had passed in measured silence. The years after her husband's death folded into one another like pages of an unread book, quiet, orderly, untouched. She woke early, made tea, fed the neighbourhood cat that never came inside, and spent long hours in a house where clocks ticked louder than voices. Her days were filled with small circular routines, polishing the silverware she no longer used, rearranging books she no longer read, knitting blankets for babies she would never meet. She had tried in the first years to fill the void. There were community groups, book clubs, a watercolour class, but everything felt like pretending. Conversations dissolved quickly. People didn't know what to do with her calmness, with her refusal to overshare. They called her dignified. What they meant was distant. Time passed. Her name was removed from mailing lists. Her phone rang less. On holidays, she baked as if expecting someone, but the table stayed set for one. The ache was never dramatic. It was more like a persistent chill in the bones, the kind that couldn't be warmed by blankets or brandy. Caroline never said aloud that she was lonely, but it lived in her gestures, in the way she lingered over voices in the grocery store, how she listened too long to strangers at the pharmacy. When she first saw Margaret, something flinched inside her. It wasn't quite recognition, but it was familiar. The girl's posture, the thinness of her coat, the way she didn't seem to belong to any place. It struck Caroline like a whisper from her own past. The instinct to offer for something, warmth, shelter, belonging, came not from kindness but from need. A quiet desperation disguised as generosity. Having Margaret in the house filled a hollow place so fully it scared her. The girl's footsteps across the floorboards, the sound of the hairdryer through the door, the occasional music from her headphones, it brought rhythm back into the walls. Caroline found herself cooking for two, buying fresh flowers, ironing pillowcases. She had someone to ask, "How was your day?" even if the answer was short. But as Margaret settled, she also began to grow. Caroline noticed it first in her posture, a straightening, a confidence. Then came the questions about job prospects, the maps of cities, the sudden silences on the phone. Margaret no longer looked like someone clinging to safety. She looked like someone preparing to leap. Caroline tried to be supportive on the surface. She smiled at the right moments, offered encouragement. But inside, she unravelled. Each signal of independence felt like a small betrayal. She began timing the girls' phone calls, reading the bus schedules Margaret left out, sniffing the air for perfumes that weren't hers. She told herself she was just being attentive. What she was afraid. The fear was not of Margaret leaving. It was of returning, to silence, to the ghost of her own voice echoing off empty rooms, to a house that would feel once again more like a museum than a home. She did not think then in the language of harm or control. She told herself stories, that she was protecting the girl, that the world outside was unkind, that perhaps Margaret wasn't ready. But beneath those stories was a simple, desperate truth. Caroline could not bear to be abandoned again. And so when she knew the girl was planning to go, something inside her shifted, not suddenly, but like a lock turning slowly. She stopped wondering how to help Margaret grow wings and started thinking how to clip them, quietly, permanently, without anger, only certainty. It happened on one of those still, brittle days that marked the end of autumn, when the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves, and the sky hung low, silver and expectant. Caroline had spent the afternoon preparing. She baked an apple pie from scratch, peeling the fruit with steady hands, slicing thin curls that fell into the mixing bowl like soft ribbons. She laid the table with care as if for a holiday meal, placing 2 wine glasses side by side and folding the napkins crisply at each plate. She lit a candle just before dusk. The flame wavered in the draught of the kitchen, casting shifting shadows on the walls. It was dark by the time Margaret arrived. Her steps were slow, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Caroline noted the tremor in the girl's hands as she removed her coat, the hesitation in her eyes. Something had shifted. Margaret looked older than the day before, older and distant, like someone rehearsing their own absence. Caroline listened as Margaret spoke. She kept her face still, her hands folded in her lap. She nodded in all the right places, but her mind had turned inward, already racing ahead. The words, thankful, grateful, time to move on, washed over her without meaning. There was only one sentence that repeated itself, silent and deafening. She's going to leave. I will be alone again. That night, the house fell into an unnatural quiet. Margaret went to bed early. Caroline stood in the hallway long after the girl's door closed, staring at the wood grain as though it could explain something. At midnight, she descended into the basement. It was cold, the kind of cold that settled into the joints and never left. The old wine cabinet was still there, pushed to the side, revealing the narrow door to the storage room beyond. The room was nothing more than concrete walls and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. It smelled of dust and long-forgotten things. Caroline stood in the centre of the space, turning slowly. Her eyes moved across the floor, the corners, the shelving. Then she began to clear it. She moved slowly, methodically. She didn't rush or panic. There was no dramatic music in her head, no sinister plan, only inevitability. She swept the floor, folded an old quilt, and retrieved a spare pillow from the linen closet upstairs. She brought down a candle, a box of matches, and the heavy latch she had kept in a drawer for decades. At dawn, she prepared breakfast. She brewed tea in the porcelain pot with the blue rim. Before pouring the cup, she added a small dose of sedative, an old prescription from her late husband's bedside drawer, long expired but still potent. She placed the cup near Margaret's elbow and set the pie on the counter, its scent still warm and sweet. Margaret sat at the table with a book open in front of her. The girl took small sips of tea between turning pages. Her eyelids grew heavy. Soon the book slid from her fingers. Her head dipped forward. Caroline caught it gently. Lifting her was not easy, but Caroline managed. She wrapped the girl in a wool blanket and cradled her as they descended the stairs. Down in the storage room, she laid Margaret on the makeshift bed, adjusted the pillow beneath her head, and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. She placed the candle on the shelf and lit it, then sat beside her. She watched the girl's chest rise and fall, the long pause between each breath. When she stood, her knees cracked softly. She stepped out of the room, pulled the door closed and locked it, the key she placed in her apron pocket. She did not cry. For 3 days, Caroline avoided the basement. She went about her life as she always had, reading the newspaper in the morning, watering her potted plants, writing out her grocery lists in perfect cursive. She moved quietly through the house, humming softly at times, as if nothing had changed. On the 4th day, she retrieved a bag of cement mix from the shed. She worked slowly, her body stiff, hands aching from the cold. She spread the mixture evenly, sealing the door behind a smooth surface of drying concrete. She painted over it with the same faded blue as the rest of the basement wall. The air smelled of dust and chemicals and finality. Upstairs, the radio played softly in the background. The weatherman spoke of an incoming cold front, of winds shifting from the north. Caroline sat in her armchair, hands folded over a blanket on her knees, listening with a blank expression. The pie was still on the counter. No one had touched it. Within a week, Caroline had erased every trace of Margaret's digital presence. She powered on the girl's phone one final time, carefully deleting messages, call logs, photos, and contacts. Then, as if performing a small ceremony, she placed the device into a linen napkin, folded it precisely, and tossed it into the trash bin behind the grocery store. She didn't look back. There would be no accidental discoveries. She made calls in the following days, speaking in a soft, steady voice. To Margaret's manager at the corner store, she explained that the girl had left town, seeking something new, something undefined. To the registrar at the local community college, she sent a typed letter, complete with Margaret's name and student ID number, stating that she would not be returning for the next semester. A note went to the small real estate agency where Margaret had once inquired about studio apartments. In each message, Caroline created a story. Margaret had found a job in another city, closer to the mountains. She was well. She was happy. She simply needed space. No one asked questions. Margaret was an adult, independent and unbound. Her absence raised no alarms. There were no police reports, no concerned relatives. People assumed what they always did when young women vanished from their orbit. She must have moved on. The world, they said, was full of transient youth, drifting from one place to the next. Caroline let them believe it. She even nodded along when neighbours mentioned how unpredictable girls could be these days. Once the practical matters were handled, the house fell back into its familiar rhythm. The quiet returned like a tide, slow and unrelenting. But this time, it didn't feel as empty. Caroline began to write letters. Once a month, always on a Sunday morning, she brewed a pot of tea, cleared the small table by the window, and selected a sheet of stationery. She used different pens, blue ink, black ink, even a green gel pen once. Each letter was addressed to herself, but signed by Margaret. The content varied, but the tone remained the same, light, affectionate, full of soft details. She wrote about things she had seen, places visited, people met. She described a cafe with cinnamon rolls that reminded her of Caroline's baking. She thanked her for everything. She reminisced about their first Christmas together. She mentioned snow that melted too fast and a second-hand coat that smelled of lavender. These were not confessions. They were performances. And they were sacred. After finishing each letter, Caroline folded the paper with care, slipped it into an envelope and sealed it with a small, quiet sigh. The envelopes went into a carved wooden box she kept beneath her bed, wrapped in a blue shawl. Occasionally, she would take one out and reread it, pretending it had arrived in the mail that morning. She even sprinkled one with perfume once, just to deepen the illusion. The ritual gave her shape. It gave the days meaning, anchoring her to a fiction that felt more comforting than any truth. The letters were proof of something, proof that Margaret had existed, that she had not vanished into nothing, that Caroline was not as alone as she seemed. In the stillness of her home, the ink on the pages became a voice, and that voice filled the silence, not entirely, but enough. Caroline had not chosen the grave out of sentiment. It was not mourning that led her there, not at first. The visit began as an impulse, driven by the gnawing, restless need to give shape to the thing she had done. She could not speak of it, could not write it in the letters, could not look directly at the door she had sealed, but something in her demanded an outlet, a vessel, a place to direct all the weight that memory refused to carry silently. The grave was anonymous enough to offer that. It was a woman's name she didn't recognise, etched into a stone left untended and unloved. No one visited. No one cleaned the moss or brushed away the leaves. The death had occurred decades ago, long enough that the living had either died themselves or simply forgotten. It was, in every way, abandoned, and that made it perfect. She convinced herself at first that it was a gesture of mercy, that perhaps this woman, whoever she had once been, deserved flowers. But even Caroline knew that wasn't true. The grave wasn't about the dead woman, it was about the girl beneath her floor. A girl with no marker, no place, no name left in the world. Margaret had vanished without a trace. Caroline had made sure of that. And still, her presence clung to the house like a draught through an old window. Caroline felt it at night when the pipes groaned. In the afternoon, when she opened the cupboard and found 2 teacups instead of 1. In the stillness between thoughts, in the silence after the radio clicked off. Margaret was there, but not in a way Caroline could hold or face, so she took the memory and transplanted it, planted it like a seed in the earth above someone else's forgotten bones. Each visit to the grave became a theatre of sanity, a ritual that allowed Caroline to believe she was coping, that she was doing the right thing. She wore her best coat, combed her hair, tied the paper around the roses with the precision of someone wrapping a gift. She rehearsed the walk from the car to the stone. She stood with solemnity, like a grieving mother or devoted friend. In her mind, this performance became proof. She was not cruel. She was not insane. She was caring for what was lost. She was remembering. But beneath that polished ritual was a darker undercurrent, something frayed and trembling. She began to speak to the grave, not as Margaret, not even as herself, but as a hybrid of them both. Her voice, soft and cracked, would drift across the stones like a prayer no one taught her. She imagined stories about the woman buried there. She imagined that perhaps she too had done something terrible, that perhaps she would understand. The two of them, Caroline and the forgotten dead, bound by silence, by secrets, by things that could not be undone. There were moments, increasingly frequent, when Caroline would touch the headstone and feel warmth, as if the stone pulsed, as if something waited beneath. These thoughts should have frightened her, but they didn't. They comforted her. She began to believe the grave was listening, that it had absorbed Margaret's presence, that in some unspoken way she had buried the truth, not just in her basement, but here, where it could rest. She never thought of confession. Confession was for people who regretted. She did not regret. She only feared being alone again. The grave solved that. It was her companion now. It anchored her. Without it, the house would feel like it was floating off the earth. And so she kept coming, not out of guilt but out of need, out of the growing suspicion that if she ever stopped, if she ever missed a month, the silence beneath the floor might rise back up and bring Margaret with it. In early spring, Caroline's body began to fail her in quiet, insistent ways. There was a tightness in her chest that came and went like a tide, first during sleep, then while climbing stairs, then simply when breathing too deeply. She told herself it was nothing, a chill in the air, a reminder of age. She avoided doctors, as she always had, convinced they would prod too much, ask questions she didn't want to answer. The pain grew familiar, manageable in the way one adjusts to loneliness or the dark. Then, one afternoon, she collapsed in the kitchen. The teapot shattered on the floor beside her, a trail of steam rising from its spout like a ghost. Her plate remained half full, the pie untouched. An open window let in the wind. The room was quiet, too quiet for the hour. It was a neighbour who noticed. A woman from 2 doors down who had come by to return a casserole dish and found the front gate unlatched, the curtains drawn, and no movement inside. She peered through the window, called out, and finally entered through the back door. Caroline was found lying on the tile, pale and unconscious, her lips slightly parted, her eyes closed, as if asleep mid-sentence. She was taken to the hospital in silence. Machines were attached. Words were exchanged. A decision was made that Caroline could not remain alone. She had no next of kin, no one to claim her, no one to protest. A quiet space was arranged for her in a care facility at the edge of town, a place with wide windows and soft music in the common rooms. Her house, after a respectful waiting period, was listed for sale. 2 months later, during a routine inspection ahead of renovation, a contractor discovered an odd patch of concrete in the basement. It differed slightly in texture, in colour. It sounded hollow when tapped. The crew returned with tools. Chunks of concrete came loose under the sledgehammer, revealing a sealed cavity behind the wall. When the dust cleared, they saw what had been hidden. The body lay curled beneath a moth-eaten blanket, surrounded by the smell of old stone and mildew. Bones, delicate and compact. Fragments of clothing still clung to the frame. A pale cardigan, a worn pair of shoes. Nearby, wrapped in plastic and tucked into the corner, they found a notebook filled with frantic handwriting and a weathered envelope containing several loose pages. Authorities were called. The news spread quickly through town. No one had expected such a story from the quiet home on Sycamore Lane. The headlines were cautious at first, then bold. Remains discovered in long abandoned room. Identity unknown. Murder or misunderstanding. The turning point came when a local reporter, one who remembered Caroline from church luncheons and charity drives, received a package with no return address. Inside was a stack of letters, dated, signed, all written in the same shaky hand. They were addressed from Margaret. The content matched no known timeline. Some read like diary entries, others like confessions. One was folded inside a blank envelope marked simply, "To whom it may concern." With the discovery of the letters, the puzzle began to take shape. People talked. Neighbours remembered things they had once dismissed. Whispers returned. They spoke of the girl who had vanished. The roses, the rituals, the old woman with the perfect lawn and the sad smile. In the nursing facility, Caroline did not respond to any of it. She was lucid enough to dress herself, to sit in the sun, to feed the birds. But she never spoke, not to staff, not to the other residents. She passed her days by the window, her lips moving as if in silent conversation with someone only she could see. Her eyes remained distant but not unfocused, always fixed on something invisible and just beyond reach. On her lap, most days, sat a cream-coloured envelope. It bore her name in that familiar, uneven hand, the same hand she had practised every Sunday. The letter inside was unsigned, but the handwriting told the truth. It was hers, left-handed, unmistakable.